Kalorama, a recorded books hybrid imprint, presents The New Border Wars, The Conflicts That Will Define Our Future, by Klaus Dodds, read by Mike Cooper. Introduction. In June 1987, President Ronald Reagan travelled to the divided city of Berlin. Standing at a podium, with the iconic Brandenburg Gate as backdrop, Reagan did not mince his words. On the formal occasion of Berlin's 750th anniversary, the former actor turned two-term president made a remarkable appeal to his Soviet equivalent, General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev. "Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." The effect of the televised speech was arguably more striking on the other side of the Berlin Wall, with East German and Soviet media claiming that Reagan's demand to tear it down was incendiary. But there was no question in West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl's judgment that Reagan's impassioned appeal anticipated a shift in the public mood. In November 1989, East German border guards failed to prevent surging crowds from opening the Brandenburg Gate, and the iconic Berlin Wall, built in the early 1960s, was broken and battered by crowds armed with hammers and pickaxes. A piece of the wall sits on my desk. In this respect, I'm not alone. It was a momentous time. Very few of us who experienced those events in person, or even via television and radio, could have failed to be moved by the desire to open gates, tear down walls, and destroy the formal border between West Germany and East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, GDR. For 4 decades, ice, iron, and bamboo curtains separated capitalist and communist worlds in the Arctic, Central and Eastern Europe, and East and Southeast Asia. Relatively few people breached those barriers, but those who did escape were household names to many North Americans and Europeans, such as Czechoslovakian tennis player Martina Navratilova, who defected in 1975 after participating in the US Open at the West Side Tennis Club, Forest Hills, Queens, New York. Navratilova was embraced by her country of choice and became a US citizen in 1981. Her adoption of the US was a propaganda victory for Reagan's America. She had rejected publicly the constraints enacted by the Czechoslovakian regime and its tennis federation. The rest is history and geography, as she travelled around the world winning Grand Slams and accumulating prize money. She's now a well-respected sports commentator and political activist, especially for LGBT rights. Tearing down communist walls and red fences and opening those borders and barriers reflected post-war optimism in the righteousness and robustness of liberal, democratic and Western countries. The end of history and end of geography was upon us, and the stark division between capitalist and communist worlds would soon disappear. Global mobility and trade would be freed from pernicious geopolitical barriers. Between the late 1980s and early 2000s, the dominant talk was of our free-flowing globalization and the rise of our geoeconomics, the hypermobility of finance, the transnationalism of trade and investment, and the global diffusion of liberal freedoms. A classic Cold War military technology, the Internet began in the 1990s to enable near-instant communication, virtual trading, and data transmission. The obituary for Manichaean geopolitics, in which everything was reduced to a struggle between good and evil, was being written, and it was not uncommon to read that authoritarian governments would be held accountable by an online community empowered by shared democratic norms and liberal values around the world. The European Union, EU, embarked on a phase of new member state expansion, and in North America, the US government signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, with Mexico and Canada. In South America, a new trading bloc, Mercosur, Southern Common Market in English, was initiated in the early 1990s and taken to be a sign that previously authoritarian and military regimes were prepared to negotiate over a common economic future rather than compete over contested borderlands and resources. In the European case, however, lingering fears about a post-Soviet Russia meant that Eastern European members such as Estonia and Poland wanted the additional security reassurance of NATO membership. Poland joined NATO in 1999 and then the EU in 2004. Article 5 of NATO's 1949 treaty states that an attack on any one NATO country is considered to be an assault on the entire membership. Hollywood might have envisioned new perils in the form of alien invasion, but the mood in the 1990s was decidedly optimistic. Aliens could come for us, but under American leadership we would prevail. Either tough mothers would prevent the end of humanity, or, as in Independence Day, the United States, led by a visionary president, would save the Earth from extraterrestrial invasion. In the 1990s, borders still acted as regulatory borders in fiction and fact, but the dominant impulse was to encourage faster flows of products, professional services, and highly skilled migrants. The predicted disappearance of the closed border was a lodestar of this era of optimism. Other movies, such as Traffic, warned viewers that free trade and open borders offered opportunities aplenty for drug cartels and criminals to profiteer, but these were in the minority. The 9/11 attacks on the United States decisively altered feelings and action around open borders. Borders were repurposed to fit new ideological prejudices and psychological needs. Hollywood changed as well, with film companies eager to capture the new, more somber geopolitical mood. The very symbol of transnational mobility, the jet plane, was repurposed as a weapon of mass destruction on the morning of September the 11th, 2001. Immediately afterwards, the George W. Bush administration closed the southern border with Mexico, but not notably with Canada. Looking for danger southwards was no accident. For much of America's post-independence history, the South and West have functioned as frontier lands, populated with stories of rapacious bandits intent on abducting white women and propagating bedlam. Later on, drug cartels and illegal immigrants have, at various moments, been blamed for rampant lawlessness and endemic violence. Mental maps can be quickly repackaged to position where we think our friends, enemies, and strangers lie. Escapism, however, remains a luxury for the most privileged. The highest-grossing films of the 2000s were semi-historical fantasies, such as the Pirates of the Caribbean, Harry Potter, and Lord of the Rings series. There were, for others, a number of ugly truths behind 9/11 and the War on Terror that deserved public exposure. Agitprop filmmaker Michael Moore used his film Fahrenheit 9/11 to confront the American public with the previously lax attitudes towards American national security, including a failure to monitor the cross-border comings and goings of third parties, from those attending a flight school in Florida to the use of private jets by the Saudi royal family. The legacy of 9/11 continues to inform contemporary geopolitics and reverberate across international borders. The Costs of War project, hosted by Brown University in the United States, estimated that U.S. spending on the War on Terror had reached $6.4 trillion. They also calculated that more than 800,000 people have died due to violence directly associated with wars in places such as Afghanistan, Yemen, and Iraq. More than 20 million people have been internally and externally displaced. Social, political, and economic reverberations continue in those aforementioned countries. Borders were routinely violated in the conflicts, and American drone strikes in Pakistan caused enormous human suffering and resentment. Meanwhile, other states, such as Russia, simply invaded, annexed, or occupied territories such as Chechnya, Crimea, and parts of Georgia, respectively. What many countries did in the midst of the War on Terror was opportunistically use the threat of terrorism and third-party attacks to settle long-running geopolitical scores and capitalize on any military and strategic advantage available. Borders were securitized in some places and violated in others. Open borders were recast as a security threat. Having resisted pushes towards further democratization in the 1990s and 2000s, Russia and China had different views about borders from the United States. In China's case, large segments of the indigenous Muslim minority population have been detained and subjected to detention and extensive surveillance, accused of fomenting extremism and separatism by the government. It's worth noting that Xinjiang province, where around 11 million Uyghurs live in the far west of China, is resource-rich and strategically positioned between Central Asian republics and Mongolia. China is determined to prevent any attempts to create a breakaway republic, and the Uyghurs are bearing the brunt of this. Russia has also waged wars on regions such as Chechnya that Moscow judges to be separatist. In this instance, the US-inspired war on terror emboldened both countries to repurpose a globalized fear of terrorism to double down on minority communities and separatist groups that threatened their national territories. Beyond China and Russia, civil societies around the world have been squeezed by surveillance and security impulses of national governments, and Western companies and countries have enabled and exported new forms of digital authoritarianism. Borders act as rallying cries for political leaders eager to re-energize national self-purpose, manufacture fears of migrants, and cherry-pick what constitutes an actionable border violation. The Make America Great Again mantra called for Americans to adopt a frontier spirit that stretched to infinity and beyond. But this kind of border language ends up destroying empathy for others. The most famous fictional Vietnam vet, John Rambo, travels south to rescue his adopted daughter from a vicious gang of Mexican bandits. In a script that could have been written by a Trump supporter hell-bent on vigilante justice, Rambo's SUV drives through security fencing somewhere along a porous Arizona-Mexico border with precious little of the surveillance military capacity that the US authorities can muster when they wish to. While impugning Mexico and other Central American countries for imperiling American borders, President Trump observed in his 2018 State of the Union address that, over the last year, the world has seen what we always knew, that no people on earth are so fearless or daring or determined as Americans. If there is a mountain, we climb it. If there's a frontier, we cross it. If there's a challenge, we tame it. If there's an opportunity, we seize it. John Rambo did that for sure. But what President Trump failed to note in the speech was that it works both ways. Americans are not the only ones who can cross, climb, swim, and walk over things and places. Migrants and refugees from Central America might wish to seize their opportunities and head towards the United States. Such a spirit might also be shared by others. Borders have taken on a new salience in the last 15 years, with militarism, terrorism, climate change, migration, and most recently pandemics fueling this resurgence of interest. There are 4 drivers of this profusion of borders: constriction, expansion, deflection, and expulsion. Governments around the world have also actively encouraged hostile environments, which are less accommodating to migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees for a whole host of reasons. First, constriction. Hostility to outsiders is not new, but what makes the current era so striking is that domestic institutions, public employers, and private citizens are being corralled into this border business in an unprecedented manner. This is not to claim that racial and housing discrimination was not already endemic. In the UK, private landlords can be served with heavy financial penalties if they fail to inform the Home Office about illegal migrants seeking to rent accommodation. University examiners have to prove their citizenship before they're employed by another university. Citizens are expected to play their part in the control and patrol of borders. In India, the Modi government stands accused of using the Citizenship Amendment Act and National Register of Citizens to wage border wars on indigenous peoples and non-Hindu citizens. Undermining citizenship acts as a proxy for land theft, marginalization, and resource extraction, all done in the name of securing Mother India. Constriction means embedding hostile environments in bureaucratic legal systems and everyday life. It places a heavy burden on those who have to be ever ready to prove that the work visa and the accompanying paperwork is in order. Sociologists such as Neera Yuval Davis produced pioneering research on this internalized border and reminded us that these experiences and practices have mushroomed in recent years. This sort of bordering can also get outsourced, so that fellow residents take it upon themselves to tell others to go home and threaten to report visa irregularities. The everyday border, underpinning hostile environments, has inspired artists, novelists, journalists, filmmakers, former border guards, immigrants and citizen activists to put pen to paper to document real-world realities and to curate those experiences. For the privileged, borders can be largely invisible in our lives and barely monitored, except in times of emergencies such as pandemics, civil disorder, natural disasters and wars. Next, we have expansion. In the United Kingdom, a series of high-profile cases, including those involving people who had arrived on HMT Empire Windrush in the late 1940s, revealed capricious examples of detention and deportation of elderly and vulnerable residents. In her 2019 book, The Windrush Betrayal, Exposing the Hostile Environment, Amelia Gentleman exposed the devastating consequences for those who felt the expanded administrative grip of the border. Lives were turned upside down, with grievous consequences for physical and mental health. Colin Grant's Homecoming, Voices of the Windrush Generation, reminds us that, for many of those affected in recent years by the Home Office's legerdemain, there's always a longer history of racism and everyday struggle. The border, like a river, has meandered in and out of people's lives, sometimes simply deluging them. All the while, nativists, racists and xenophobes warn repeatedly about Britain being flooded by immigrants. In the European Union, the border region is part of an expansive EU territorial classification ranging from Level 1 to Level 3 territorial units. Level 3 units are border regions that share a land border and where half the national population lives within 15 miles of the said border. This system appears apolitical because the EU promotes itself as a borderless bloc of like-minded nations. Other countries take a different view of their borders. The US-Mexico, India-Pakistan and Israel-Palestine borderlands attract a corpulent body of reportage and creative work, seeking to explore and exploit stories of the border. In large part, this heightened level of interest is due either to them acting as migratory choke points or being animated by prevailing geopolitical tension. The US-Mexico land border is commonly regarded as a line of division not only between two independent countries, but the global North and South. On closer inspection, the line is not quite as clear-cut as some might wish. American business opted to invest in cheaper manufacturing plants in Mexico, while illegal migrant labor plays a crucial role in the agricultural and service sector north of the border. Some welcome migrants, others want to deport them. Meanwhile, migrants from the south travelling north see the border as an obstacle to cross or an opportunity to make money. Your view of any border tends to reflect relative power, country of origin, and racial privilege. It can expand, expel, contract, and deflect. It is, however, often at the border where contemporary and future geopolitics reveals itself. Shortly after worsening tensions between Iran and the US in January 2020, around 200 American citizens of Iranian descent described how they were detained at the US-Canada border for up to 10 hours. Detainees complained that they were being asked about their political allegiances and views. The inference appeared clear to those detained. Some residents and citizens were not to be trusted because of their family heritage, an experience that many Arab Americans spoke about after 9/11. Elsewhere, in the literary world, Mexican and Mexican-American authors and journalists took to the airwaves and social media platforms to criticize a white American woman for writing a novel about the experiences of a mother and son trying to leave Mexico and head towards the United States. Janine Cummins's American Dirt attracted huge interest from publishers and controversy about whether she was right to try, in her words, to humanize the faceless brown mass by depicting struggles to cross the border without herself having had experiences of these challenges. Then we have deflection. The desire to use borders to deflect attention away from other issues, such as the shadowy role played by migrants in a host of activities from agriculture to hospitality and food service sectors. The political left has railed against the moral depravity of borders, while the political right argues that borders are vital to control those who would wish to enter from elsewhere. Both sides argue about the legality, morality, and profitability of borders and regimes of control. It turns out, in many countries, including much of Europe and North America, migrant labour is crucial to virtually every sector of society. While new measures have been put in place to make it even harder for migrants to claim asylum status in the United States and many parts of Europe, distinguishing between the migrant, the asylum seeker, and the refugee is something which some political leaders don't want to bother with. The Trump administration has pushed for Central American refugees to remain in Mexico while they wait, sometimes for months, for their claims to be adjudicated. Other countries, such as Guatemala, have been declared safe third countries, which means that migrants entering into that country are expected to claim asylum there. The Trump administration signed new migration agreements with Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. The latter two famously went to war over border and migratory tensions in what was termed the 1969 Soccer War, in return for the US not imposing further economic pressures on those countries. Mexico is also under pressure to do more to deter migrants from travelling north. Finally, we have expulsion. Successive presidents and prime ministers in countries around the world have invested in securing their homelands, spying on domestic and foreign populations, and manning the external borders of their respective countries. They have not been alone in this border theatre, a way of looking tough and purposeful, without actually being honest and straightforward about what might drive these impulses. They include worries about immigrants overwhelming settled populations, what might be termed replacement anxieties, to an outright dread towards anything and anyone who disrupts business as normal. Like a highly contagious winter flu, or worse, a COVID-19 infection, other governments around the world, both liberal democratic and authoritarian, have embraced the border frenzy. Walls, fences and barriers, alongside digital surveillance and tracking, are commonplace. Thanks to countless TV reality shows, fly-on-the-wall documentaries, and a gamut of films and video games, Western audiences have been virtually immersed into border security. It's now possible to watch shows about Australian and New Zealand customs officials, British and Irish airport security teams, and scores of American and Canadian shows following border guards, police officers, and Homeland Security staff. We now talk about border security TV as a distinct type of reality show, which captures this re-enchantment with border control and security. Wendy Brown, in her book Walled States, Waning Sovereignty, made the compelling case that a great deal of this is simply about governments and publics coming to terms, slowly and reluctantly, with the fact that having exclusive control of one's territory, including its border, is simply a fairy tale. Brown's assessment spoke of waning, not disappearance. Even when the television cameras are not around, there are plenty of examples of nations around the world that continue to embrace the promise of beefed-up border security strategies. The intersection of physical and psychogeographies of the border matter. In August 2019, the small, oil-rich state Equatorial Guinea provoked outrage in Cameroon. The source of the irritation was its plan to erect a 125-mile security wall along the two countries' mutual border. The wall itself, however, was not the only source of tension. Cameroonian officials were concerned that the markers being deployed to outline the positioning of the wall were crossing the recognized international boundary between the two states. The markers were, by their very positioning, deemed provocative. The two countries have a history of frosty relations. Ever since Equatorial Guinea became an oil exporter in the 1990s, it's accused Cameroon of doing little to deter illegal migrants eager to seek new employment in the smaller country. Equatorial Guinea's offshore oil and gas production makes it one of the biggest players in the African energy market, and it is classified as a middle-income country compared to its immediate neighbours such as Cameroon and Gabon. The border wall project comes at a time when the incumbent Equatorial Guinean president, Teodoro Obiang, finds himself condemned for human rights abuses, embezzlement and endemic corruption. It's widely regarded as a diversion strategy that helps to inflame domestic public opinion while simultaneously appealing to his supporters, many of whom worry about the scale and pace of social, economic and cultural change. When US presidential candidate Donald Trump told American audiences in February 2016 that he was going to build a beautiful wall and get Mexico to pay for it, he was ridiculed by many. But he mobilized for many voters a persistent fear that America's borders were in peril, and by association, the nation itself. The southern border became, yet again, a fertile ground for invasion fantasies. A century earlier, border security consisted of 4 strands of barbed wire and was largely designed to keep out rogue cattle. Over the decades, the rhetoric and practice of border patrolling and management hardened as fears of Latin American illegal migration grew. The war on drugs, inaugurated by the Nixon administration in the early 1970s, reinforced the drift towards the militarization of the border. Drugs, crime, and later terrorism left their mark on the people of the southern United States and northern Mexico. The growing fears of Latin American illegal migration simply add further nourishment to what have been termed white anxieties about how to secure borders and restore waning sovereignty. On the ground. While borders are something to be exploited by politicians, they are also grounded somewhere. While the everyday border can make itself felt in our towns and cities, we should not forget that the lines we draw on maps are to be found etched on and in deserts, plains, mountains, rivers, lakes, seas, jungles, and even subterranean environments. Air is partitioned up into parcels of national and international airspace, and third parties are expected to secure permission before entering into airspace above national territory, as well as 12 nautical miles from any corresponding coastline. In areas of the world where there is prevailing tension, such as the South China Sea and in and around Syria, it's common to hear rival militaries accusing one another of violating their national airspace. Given the speed of military jets and the nature of airspace, these violations might be measured in mere seconds, with nothing more than a vapor trail left in the violator's wake. On terra firma, rivers, mountains and deserts have long provided physical opportunities to impose borders and hardwire partition or separation. Sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. The Pyrenees have long been thought of as a natural border between Spain and France, defined in 1659 by the respective kingdoms, but people and animals have found ways of crisscrossing the mountain ridges and valleys. It was not until 1866–68 and the Treaty of Bayonne that Spain and France agreed on a defined national border, using watersheds and summits to weave their way around a shared mountainous environment. As Chapter 2 reveals, the border rules we use for mountains end up being undermined by natural change. Ridges and crests get eroded and denuded over time, and a retreating glacier, in all likelihood, will provoke fresh opportunities to reborder. Border infrastructure rarely does the security work that some might hope. Rules are made, procedures are put in place, but then something else happens to expose the fragility in all of this. In January 2018, CCTV captured pictures of a curious elephant approaching a security post on the China and Laos border. The elephant calmly lifted its feet and walked over the security barrier. Within 2 hours, the elephant returned to China after some late-night foraging. No one was brave enough to try to stop it. It serves as a harmless example of nature rebelling against human borders. Climate change, including more extreme weather events, is raising the stakes, however. The Earth does not remain passive in the face of human intervention. For years, environmentalists and affected communities have warned that local walls and barriers worsen natural hazards such as flash flooding. Border security paraphernalia interferes with cross-border migration flows of animals, large and small. Border communities, often made up of indigenous peoples in many parts of the world, have had their lives turned upside down by border fortification. Governments compound matters by re-engineering landscapes. It's not uncommon for tunnels to be dug, river courses altered, canyons filled in, and hilltops flattened. Moving dirt and diverting water to enable the building process itself are integral to border security projects around the world.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?